We open with the universal, terrifying imagery of the devil, bat-like wings, falling like lightning, the eternal adversary. We quote the famous verse from Isaiah 14, "How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn." We establish the stakes. Millions of people fear this entity. Wars have been fought, inquisitions launched, and exorcisms performed in his name. But then, the destabilizing drop. We reveal that the name Lucifer was never in the original Hebrew Bible. It is a linguistic phantom, a Roman ghost inserted centuries later. The micro-mystery: if the devil wasn't named Lucifer, who exactly fell from heaven? Chapter 1. Relatable context and the first crack. We ground the viewer in the orthodox Sunday school narrative, an archangel of light consumed by pride, leading a cosmic rebellion before the creation of Eden. It's a clean, epic backstory, but something doesn't add up. We open the physical pages of the Old Testament to Isaiah chapter 14. When we zoom out and read the surrounding verses, the cosmic scale shatters. Isaiah isn't describing a supernatural realm at all. He is mocking a human being, the fallen. Star is a political taunt directed at a tyrannical, flesh and blood king of Babylon. The micro-mystery: how did an ancient political diss track get mistaken for the origin story of Satan? Chapter 2. The hidden texts and the Roman contagion. We dive into the ancient Hebrew text. The words used by Isaiah are Helel ben Shahar, literally, shining one, son of the dawn. This is a direct reference to an ancient Canaanite myth about the morning star, Venus, trying to usurp the throne of the high god, only to be cast down to the underworld. Isaiah was using a well-known pagan myth to mock the Babylonian king's arrogance. And this is where the historical record goes dark. Until the 4th century, enter Saint Jerome, tasked with translating the Hebrew Bible into Latin, the Vulgate. For morning star, Jerome used the Latin word for Venus, the light-bringer, Lucifer, the micro-mystery. Jerome knew it was just a translation of a planet's name. So who weaponized the word, turning a Latin noun into a demonic proper name? Chapter 3. The twist, the construction of a monster. This raises an unsettling question. If the original text was just ancient political satire, why did the church need Lucifer? We explore the theological shift in the early centuries of Christianity. The church was expanding and needed a unified, terrifying antagonist to explain the presence of evil in a world governed by an all-powerful God. Early church fathers like Origen and Tertullian began reading Isaiah 14 not as history, but as allegory. They stripped the Babylonian king of his humanity, merged the Latin word Lucifer with the serpent of Genesis and the dragon of Revelation, and Frankensteined a single, cohesive cosmic villain. We also touch upon how John Milton's Paradise Lost solidified this myth in the public psyche forever. Chapter 4. The conclusion, the burden of the myth. We wrap up by examining the psychological and structural power of this translation error. The church didn't just misread a text. They suppressed its historical context because a supernatural terror is infinitely more useful for maintaining religious authority than a dead Mesopotamian king. We leave the audience with a chilling realization. The ultimate embodiment of evil, the antagonist of the Western world, is nothing more than a clerical error wrapped in a poem. Close your eyes and picture him, the great adversary. Leathered bat wings, eyes burning with eternal malice, plunging from the celestial heavens like a dying star. This is the origin story we all know. The ultimate betrayal, the most beautiful. Angel in the heavenly host, consumed by an intoxicating, blinding pride. He sought to place his throne above the stars of God, and for that arrogance, he was hurled into the abyss. You can almost hear the thunder of his fall in the book of Isaiah, chapter 14, verse 12. How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn. You have been cast down to the earth, you who once laid low the nations. For millennia, this exact verse has been the bedrock of Western demonology. It is The genesis of hell's sovereign. Wars of religion have been fought, devastating inquisitions have been justified, and countless exorcisms have been performed, all invoking the name of this fallen morning star, Lucifer. But there is a terrifying crack in this foundation, a secret hidden in plain sight, buried beneath centuries of dogma and Latin ink. If you were to travel back in time, hand the original Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament to the prophets who wrote them and ask them about Lucifer, they wouldn't know who you were talking about. The name Lucifer does not exist in the original Hebrew Bible, not once. It is a linguistic phantom, a Roman ghost inserted into the holy text centuries after the ink had dried, which brings us to our first micro-mystery. If the devil wasn't named Lucifer, if that name is a complete fabrication, then who exactly fell from heaven? Chapter 1, The Phantom King. Welcome to the Veil of Sin. I am your guide into the archives, and today we are dissecting the architecture of hell. Let's ground ourselves in the Orthodox narrative. The story of Lucifer's rebellion is so culturally pervasive that it feels like canonical law. We are taught that long before the mud of Eden was shaped into Adam, a cosmic civil war raged. A perfect being looked at his own reflection and decided he was worthy of worship. It's a clean, epic backstory. It perfectly explains the origin of evil in a universe created by a benevolent God. Think about the psychological comfort of this myth. If evil is an external supernatural force, a rogue angel prowling the earth, then human beings are merely collateral damage in a divine war. It shifts the blame away from us, but something doesn't add up. When we strip away the Renaissance paintings, when we silence the dramatic retellings of Paradise Lost, and we actually open the physical ancient pages of the Old Testament, the cosmic scale of this war completely shatters. Let's look at the scene of the crime, Isaiah chapter 14. For centuries, theologians have isolated verse 12, putting it on a pedestal, treating it as a window into a supernatural, prehistoric dimension. But read the verse before it. Read the verse after it. Zoom out. Context is the enemy of mythology. The book of Isaiah is a prophetic text dealing with the very real, very bloody geopolitics of the ancient Near East. Isaiah isn't a cosmic historian, chronicling the dawn of time. He's an ancient political commentator. In chapter 14, he is writing a taunt, a mockery, a sarcastic eulogy, and he explicitly tells us who this taunt is directed at in verse 4. He writes, "You will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon, the king of Babylon, a flesh and blood human being, a tyrant who oppressed the Israelites, crushed their cities, and possessed an ego so massive he believed himself to be divine." To the ancient Israelites, Babylon was the great beast, the oppressor, the ultimate embodiment of human evil. So, when this tyrannical dynasty finally began to crumble, the prophet Isaiah didn't hold back. He penned one of the most vicious, gloating passages in ancient literature. The entire chapter is a brutal, poetic roast of a dead dictator. Isaiah is saying, "Look at you. You thought you were a god. You thought you could ascend to the heavens. But now you're dead, rotting in the dirt just like the rest of us." Let's look at the verses immediately following the famous morning star line. Isaiah writes, "Your pomp is brought down to the grave. Maggots are spread out under you, and worms cover you. Angels don't rot. Spirits don't get eaten by worms. Mortals do." The text is entirely, undeniably grounded in biology and terrestrial politics. The fallen star isn't a demon. It's a metaphor. It is a political taunt directed at human arrogance. But the terrifying part isn't that Isaiah was writing about a man. The terrifying part is what happened next. How did an ancient, politically charged diss track about a Mesopotamian king get violently twisted into the definitive origin story of Satan? How did a mortal man transform into an immortal monster? This raises an unsettling question about the very nature of the texts we call sacred, and the human hands that translated them. We left off with a human king rotting in the dirt. But to understand how this mortal tyrant was resurrected as a cosmic demon, we have to leave the dirt and look up at the sky. Long before the Israelites wrote down the book of Isaiah, ancient humanity was obsessed with the stars. They watched the heavens with a desperate intensity, looking for patterns, gods, and meaning. And one celestial body stood out above all the rest, the planet we now call Venus. To the ancient world, Venus was a profound mystery. It appeared as a dual entity. It was the last, most brilliant star to shine in the morning before the sun rose, and the first to appear in the evening. They called it the morning star. It was beautiful, defiant, and tragically doomed. Every dawn, this brilliant light would rise, appearing as though it were challenging the sun itself for supremacy over the sky. But every morning, without fail, the sun's overwhelming fire would obliterate the morning star, casting it down into the invisible abyss of the daylight. This daily astronomical phenomenon, this cosmic defeat, birthed a myth. In 1929, archaeologists, excavating the ancient city of Ugarit, uncovered a trove of clay tablets that shattered our understanding of biblical context. These Ugaritic texts detailed the religion of the ancient Canaanites, the immediate neighbors and frequent rivals of the Israelites. Etched into these tablets was the story of a minor god named Atar. Atar was the Canaanite deity of the morning star. According to the myth, Atar became arrogant. He attempted to usurp the throne of Baal, the supreme storm god. Atar ascended to the highest heavens and sat upon the divine throne, but he found he was too small, too weak to wield the power. As punishment for his pride, he was cast down to the underworld to rule over the dead. Now, bring this back to our politically charged prophet Isaiah. When Isaiah wanted to write a diss track about the king of Babylon, he didn't invent a new story out of thin air. He reached into the cultural zeitgeist. He weaponized a pagan myth that his audience would immediately recognize. He looked at the Babylonian king, a tyrant who literally believed he was divine, and basically said, "You are just like Atar. You are the morning star. You tried to reach the highest heavens, but you are going to be cast down into the pit." Look closely at the original Hebrew text of Isaiah 14:12. The exact words etched into the parchment are Helel ben Shahar. Literally translated, this means shining one, son of the dawn. Helel is the shining one, Shahar is the dawn. There is no evil entity here. There is no demonic overlord. There is only a poetic astronomical metaphor used to roast a dead dictator. And for centuries, that is exactly how the text was understood. When Jewish scholars translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek in the 3rd century BCE, they understood the metaphor perfectly. They translated Helel ben Shahar into the Greek word eosphoros, which literally means dawnbringer. Again, an astronomical term, no horns, no pitchforks. But history is a game of telephone played across millennia, where the stakes are eternal. Damnation, the true catastrophic shift, the linguistic mutation that birthed a monster, happened in the late 4th century. The Roman Empire had adopted Christianity. The church was rapidly centralizing its power, and it desperately needed a standardized official Bible in the language of the empire. Latin. Enter Eusebius Sophronius Hieronymus, better known to history as Saint Jerome. In the year 382 AD, the Pope commissioned Jerome to produce the definitive Latin translation of the scriptures. Jerome relocated to a cave in Bethlehem, dedicating years of his life to painstakingly translating the original Hebrew and Greek texts into Latin. This monumental, exhausting work would become the Latin Vulgate, the absolute theological authority for the Western Church for over 1,000 years. Imagine the burden on Jerome's shoulders. To mistranslate a single word was to alter the very voice of God. When Jerome reached Isaiah 14:12, he stared at the Hebrew Hallel and the Greek Eosphoros. He needed the exact Latin equivalent for the morning star, the planet Venus. In Roman astronomy, the term for the morning star was composed of 2 parts: lux, meaning light, and fere, meaning to bring or bear. Put them together, and you get the Latin noun for the light bringer. Lucifer. Let me make this absolutely clear. In the 4th century, Lucifer was not a proper noun. It was not a name. It was an ordinary lowercase Latin word. If you read other Latin texts from the era, you will find Lucifer used to describe the literal sunrise. It is even used in the New Testament. In the Latin Vulgate itself, Jesus Christ is referred to as the Stella Matutina, and in the book of 2 Peter as Lucifer, the morning star arising in your hearts. Which brings us to the most unsettling micro-mystery of this investigation. If the word was so benign that it was used as a title for Jesus Christ himself, how did it become synonymous with absolute, unadulterated evil? Jerome knew he was just writing the name of a planet. The early readers of the Vulgate knew it was just an astronomical term. So who weaponized the word? Who capitalized the L, stripped the word of its astronomical reality, and turned a Latin noun into the proper name of the devil? We have the weapon, a translated text. We have the time, the early Middle Ages. But we still need the motive, and the motive is control. Understood. Stripping away the visual blueprint. Here is the raw, uncut narration for Chapter 3. Let the theological crime scene speak for itself. Chapter 3. The Chimera. We are looking at a theological crime scene. The weapon was a Latin dictionary. The victim was historical context, but this raises an unsettling question. Why did the early Christian church, an institution founded on the teachings of a pacifist carpenter from Nazareth, desperately need a cosmic monster? To understand the twist in our narrative, we have to travel back to the first few centuries of the Common Era. The church was no longer a small, persecuted Jewish sect. It was rapidly becoming a sprawling, Hellenistic intellectual powerhouse. And as it grew, it ran headfirst into the ultimate philosophical brick wall, the problem of evil. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and entirely benevolent, why does the world bleed? Why are there plagues that wipe out cities, famines that starve children, and cruel empires that crush the innocent? The ancient Israelites had a different framework. In the older text of the Hebrew Bible, God is responsible for both the light and the dark. God creates prosperity, and God creates disaster. But for the expanding Christian theology, which was heavily influenced by Greek dualism, the strict philosophical division between pure spirit and corrupt matter, this was unacceptable. God had to be entirely good. The darkness needed a different author. They needed a scapegoat. Enter Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century. Origen was a brilliant, eccentric, and highly influential theologian. He popularized a method of reading the scriptures called allegorical exegesis. His rule was simple. If a text didn't make logical or theological sense literally, it must have a hidden spiritual meaning. Origen looked at Isaiah chapter 14. He read the taunt against the king of Babylon, but Origen looked at the sheer epic poetry of the text, the references to ascending to the heavens, to being cast down to the earth, and he decided it was too grand, too majestic to be about a mere mortal. Origen disconnected the text from its historical anchor. He argued that the prophet Isaiah was using the Babylonian king as a metaphor for a much darker, ancient, spiritual rebellion. He was the first major thinker to explicitly link the falling star of Isaiah 14 to the words of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." But Origen only laid the groundwork. The true construction of the monster happened over the next few centuries. It was a massive theological stitching process, a Frankenstein experiment, performed by early church fathers and medieval scholars. They didn't just create a new character, they absorbed old ones. Let's look at the anatomical parts of this chimera. First, they needed an adversary. In the original Hebrew texts, like the Book of Job, there is a figure called Ha-Satan. But here is the secret. Ha-Satan isn't a proper name, it's a title. It translates literally to the accuser or the adversary. In the ancient Israelite worldview, Ha-Satan wasn't God's enemy, he was God's prosecuting attorney. His job was to patrol the earth and test the loyalty of mortals. He worked for the divine court. But the early church stripped Ha-Satan of his divine employment and turned the title into the proper name of God's ultimate enemy, Satan. Next, they needed a point of origin for human sin. So, they went back to the very first book of the Bible, Genesis. They looked at the serpent in the Garden of Eden. In the original Hebrew text, the serpent is never identified as a demon. It is explicitly described merely as the most clever of all the wild animals. It was an origin myth to explain why snakes crawl on their bellies and why humans fear them. But the theologians retroactively injected their new adversary into the snake. The serpent was suddenly a disguise. Finally, they needed a prophetic endgame. They turned to the Book of Revelation, a highly symbolic psychedelic text written by early Christians undergoing violent persecution. Revelation speaks of a great red dragon. Historically, this dragon was almost certainly a coded political reference to Rome itself, specifically the tyrannical Emperor Nero. But the church stripped away the political coding and declared the Dragon to be the literal, eternal manifestation of evil. So, you have the prosecuting attorney, the clever snake, and the political dragon. 3 completely distinct literary characters written centuries apart by different authors for different audiences, but they needed a bow to tie it all together. They needed a tragic origin story to explain how this evil came to be, and waiting. There in the Latin Vulgate, shining like a beacon, was Saint Jerome's translation of Isaiah 14:12, the fallen lightbringer, Lucifer. They took the name, capitalized the L, and grafted it onto their newly stitched Chimera. The human king of Babylon was officially erased. In his place stood Lucifer, the angel of light turned lord of darkness, the serpent of Eden, the adversary of Job, and the dragon of the Apocalypse. One unified, cohesive, terrifying antagonist to blame for all the suffering in the world. This theological construct was powerful, but it remained largely academic, until it was cemented into the public consciousness by the greatest PR campaign in literary history. In 1667, the blind English poet John Milton published Paradise Lost, an epic poem detailing the fall of man. Milton took the church's Frankenstein monster and gave him a voice, a personality, and a tragic, almost heroic psychology. It was Milton who gave Lucifer the immortal lines, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." Milton's poem was so mesmerizing, so emotionally gripping, that it essentially overwrote the Bible in the minds of the public. To this day, when most people picture the devil, when they quote his motives or envision his rebellion in heaven, they are not quoting scripture. They are quoting a 17th century poet who was dramatizing a 4th century translation error of an 8th century BCE political diss track. We have reached the end of the thread. The linguistic autopsy is complete. We have successfully traced the DNA of the devil and found absolutely no trace of the supernatural. We found a dead dictator. We found a Canaanite star myth. We found a stressed Roman translator in a cave. And we found a brilliant blind English poet. The monster is a fabrication, an architectural marvel built out of mistranslated ink. But this realization does not offer comfort. In fact, it leads us to the darkest, most unsettling revelation of this entire investigation. Because a myth, once it is weaponized by an institution, becomes vastly more dangerous than any literal demon could ever be. Think about the sheer utilitarian genius of the Lucifer construct. If evil is merely human, if the ultimate adversary is just a corrupt king, a greedy politician, or a broken societal system, then humanity bears the responsibility of fixing it. We have to overthrow the king. We have to change the laws. We have to look inward. But if evil is a cosmic, invisible, supernatural overlord, if a rogue archangel is actively prowling the earth seeking the ruin of souls, then human effort is useless. You cannot legislate a demon. You cannot protest a fallen angel. You can only do one thing. You must submit entirely to the divine authority that offers protection. The early church created the ultimate spiritual disease, and in doing so, secured a total, unassailable monopoly on the cure. This wasn't just theology. This was statecraft. This was the architecture of an absolute empire. By convincing the masses that they were caught in the crossfire of a prehistoric war between God and Lucifer, the religious institution positioned itself as the only safe harbor. Absolute obedience was no longer a political demand. It was a matter of eternal survival. And this is where the history of this translation error turns violently, horribly real. This is where the ink bleeds. Because when you invent an invisible monster, you inevitably have to start finding his visible accomplices. Consider the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1486 by a Catholic clergyman. This text became the official handbook for the Inquisition. It explicitly detailed how the devil, Lucifer, operated in the physical world through pacts with human beings, mostly women. Over the next 3 centuries, tens of thousands of people, healers, outcasts, independent women, the mentally ill, were subjected to unspeakable tortures. They were stretched on racks, burned at the stake, and drowned in rivers. Every single scream, every drop of blood spilled during the European witch trials was justified by the absolute, unquestioned belief in the entity created by St. Jerome's Latin dictionary. They were fighting a ghost, and they slaughtered their neighbors to do it. But we cannot relegate this to the ignorance of the Middle Ages. The psychological contagion of Lucifer is remarkably resilient. Fast forward to the late 20th century, specifically the 1980s and 90s. We experienced an era known as the Satanic Panic, a massive nationwide hysteria fueled by daytime talk shows and zealous law enforcement. Thousands of people genuinely believed that highly organized underground cults of Satanists were operating in every city, sacrificing children and communicating with the Dark Lord. Lives were ruined. Innocent people were sentenced to decades in prison based on coerced, fantastical testimonies. And while no evidence of these sprawling satanic networks was ever found, the panic was real. The terror was real. Because the archetype of Lucifer is so deeply hardwired into our cultural operating system that we are always ready to project it onto someone else. This is the true burden of the myth. The terrifying reality is not that Lucifer exists. The terrifying reality is why we so desperately want him to. We need the devil. We crave the existence of an external monster. Because if there is no Lucifer, if there is no Dark Lord whispering temptations into our ears, then who is to blame for the nightmare of human history? If Satan didn't orchestrate the Crusades, or the transatlantic slave trade, or the Holocaust, or the countless genocides that stained the earth, then who did? We did. Flesh and blood human beings. The exact same kind of arrogant, power-hungry, mortal creatures that the prophet Isaiah was warning us about nearly 3,000 years ago. Isaiah wasn't looking into a spiritual dimension to explain evil. He was pointing his finger directly at the throne room of Babylon. He was telling us that the monsters are real, but they don't have bat wings, and they don't fall from the sky. They wear crowns. They wear suits. They command armies. They are driven by the exact same terrestrial greed and pride that has plagued our species since the dawn of civilization. By turning the king of Babylon into a cosmic bogeyman, we committed the ultimate act of psychological evasion. We let the real tyrants off the hook. We spent 2,000 years looking up at the sky in fear, searching for a falling star, while the real empires of Babylon continued to crush the innocent right here in the dirt. The greatest trick the church ever pulled wasn't convincing the world that the devil exists. It was convincing us to look for him in hell so we wouldn't see him sitting on the throne. The archives are closing. The text has been exposed. It is time to stop fearing the ghosts of Roman translation. It is time to turn our attention back to the mortal kings